Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Today I want to talk a little bit about numbers in Old Norse. A lot of people ask about this either because they're learning Old Norse and want to know more about how numbers work, or out of a general curiosity about language perhaps, and how this particular language handles numbers and counting and such. One thing that I'll say right off the bat is that a lot of people confuse written language with spoken language. And so I get asked a lot if there are Old Norse words for 1 or 13 or 9 or 55, whatever number somebody wants. And even if I say, yes, there's a word for it and it's this, that, or the other word, what they often mean is there a rune that represents that number? But as far as we can tell in actual runic inscriptions from the Middle Ages and before, there are not separate symbols that mean numbers, nor a way to use the letter symbols to mean numbers. Of course, typically in modern English and most languages today, we use Arabic numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But you can also represent those as Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And neither way of indicating the numeral is actually a comment on the language used, right? No matter what language I speak, it can be English, it can be Japanese, it can be Akkadian. If I write the number with that symbol, I mean that number concept, and I'll say the word in my language, be that 1 in English or itten in Icelandic or whatever. And so the words were certainly there, certainly in Old Norse and before they could count to whatever number and had a way of expressing it. But that doesn't mean there's a symbol for it. In runes, typically numbers are just written out as words. So instead of having a particular symbol that stands for ein, meaning 1, you simply write the word ein out in runes in Old Norse. All right, so let's talk about some unusual or interesting characteristics of numbers in Old Norse. One is that in early Old Norse, getting into the 1200s, but probably not lasting through the 1200s, so the century in which most of our written texts were put ink to vellum, they were written down. 100, or Old Norse hundrað, did not mean 100, but 120. And the same thing with thusand, which meant not 1000, but 1200. You can certainly see the resemblance to English hundred and thousand. And of course, especially after the 1200s and now in the modern Scandinavian languages, these words or their descendants mean hundred and thousand, as in 100 and 1000. But in Old Norse, typically, I assume, unless the text seems particularly late, that that's what they mean. So, for example, in translating Grimnismal, stanza 23, the first half, where it says in Old Norse, 500 golva och fjórum tugum, svo hygg ek bilskirni med bugum. Thor's Hall, Bilskirnir, has 640 rooms, so I think, with its windings. But 640, which I'm translating, actually translates word for word 540, but I'm multiplying 5 times 120 rather than 5 times 100. What that means too is that in counting to 120, since 120 is 100, 100, what we consider 100, is the equivalent of 10. What we consider 110 is the equivalent of 11. So tiu tigr, elevu tigr. So Bilbo's 111th birthday would actually be sort of a normal way of expressing it in the more archaic Old Norse system. And also in early Old Norse, and here I'm talking, again, pre-1300 or so, when you get a little bit more incorporation into the intellectual life of the rest of Europe, the 10s past 20 aren't yet compound words, like our 30, 40, 50, 60, etc., or even modern Icelandic 30, 40, etc. Instead, there's a special word that means units of 10. And you see this in a lot of different forms, tigir, tegir, tugir. And what you do is you treat that as plural, decline it as a U-stem masculine noun, and then you use the genitive of whatever is counted. So you can actually see an example of that in that stanza from Grimnismal. 500 golva och fjórum tugum. So fjórum tugum, that's the dative plural of 4 of these units of 10, so that's 40. And then golva, floors, or rooms, is in the genitive plural because that's what's being counted. You don't use the, it doesn't agree with the case of the number being counted. In this case, 40, which is in the dative. So this is a characteristic of really early texts. We see also, for instance, in the Stockholm Homily book, where a lot of this archaic language is easily found, you see, for instance, fastati fjora tegu daga, fasted 40 days. So that's 4 tens of days with daga genitive plural. Also, you see things like thrir tigir mana, 3 tens of men, i.e. 30 men. And 300 skippa, 300s of ships, i.e. 360 ships, or 3000 kvenna, 3,000s of women, i.e. 3,000 women. So 100 and 1,000 work the same way in early Old Norse, where instead of just expressing the same case, and instead of agreeing like an adjective, they're basically nouns. This is a group of 100 of these things, right? So 100 of mountains rather than 100 mountains. We also get some real creativity as far as indicating numbers, especially when you combine these units of 10 with more basic numbers. So for example, 31, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Let's just assume it's all going to be in the nominative. So you could say, the closest thing to English would be something like thrior, or excuse me, it's masculine, thrir tigir och ein, 3 tens and 1. But you can also reverse the 1 and the 30, so you could say ein och thrir tigir. That's pretty normal. But also perfectly acceptable and not that weird in Old Norse is to say something that poses a little bit more of a second grade math problem. Elivu och tutugu, 11 and 20 for 31, or tutugu och elivu, doing it the other way. Sometimes you also see something like einum miður and fjórir tigir, 1 less than 4 tens. That means 39. So let's look now, before I continue with some of these other characteristics, let's actually talk a little bit about the characteristics of numbers in Old Norse. And the most basic characteristics, what are they? So if you know how to count in Old Norse, this will be a little bit boring, but I'll help you learn to count. First of all, numbers, if they come in multiple forms based on gender, so they agree with the gender of the thing they're counting, they will still be counted in masculine. So if you're simply counting seconds down or something like that, you count in the masculines. That's what I'm going to do here. And I'll talk about how to inflect words that inflect a little bit later. So 1 to 10. Ein, tver, thrir, fjórir, fim, sex, sjá, åtta, níu, tíu. And then from 11 to 20, ellefu, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Then for 21 through 29, it's pretty simple. You simply say tutugu, 20, and 1, and 2, and 3, or 1 and 20, 2 and 20, 3 and 20. The order doesn't matter. And as I discussed, then the tens beyond that, 30, 40, 50, are made by combining this word for a group of 10, tigir, with the masculine form of the number that's being compounded with them. So 3 tigir, 4 tigir, 5 tigir, 6 tigir, 7 tigir, 8 tigir, 9 tigir, 10 tigir, 10 tigir, 10 basically, meaning what we mean by 100. And then 11 tigir being 110, and 100 being 100. Okay, so then 100 is neuter. So if you want to say 200s, you use the neuter forms of the numbers that actually inflect for gender. So let's talk a little bit about the inflection before we get further in this. The number 1 is basically inflected just like the definite article, the. So ein, eins, enum, ein, eina, einar, eini, eight, eins, enu. Then 2, in masculine we have tver, tvo, tveggja, tveim, or tveimur. Feminine, tver, tver, tveggja, and tveimur. And neuter, tvau, tvau, tveggja, tveimur. So of course, use the masculine to refer to a masculine noun, a feminine to refer to feminine, neuter to refer to neuter or to mixed. And of course, that's the origin of the little joke in Thrymskvida when Loki says, we two, vi två, he uses the neuter. He's saying that of him and Thor, one of them is female. And then 3 also inflects for case, gender, well, not number, because the number is 3. So masculine, you have thrir, thrió, thryggja, and then in the dative thrimr, or thrym, or thremr, or threm. Feminine is thrior, thrior, and then thryggja, and then thremr or thremr, and then neuter thriu, thriu, thryggja, and thremr, thremr, thrym, threm, etc. And then in the number 4, masculine fjórir, fjóra, fjogora, fjórum, feminine fjórar, fjórar, fjogora, fjórum, neuter fjógur, fjógur, fjogora, fjórum. And then beyond that, 5 and above aren't inflected. So 100 though is a regular neuter noun, so hundrað, hundrað, hundraðs, hundraði, and then the plural with u umlaut, hundruð, hundruð, hundraða, hundruðum. Since it's neuter, if you have 200s, you do use the neuter form of 1, 2, 3, 4. So 8 hundrað, 2 hundruð, 3 hundruð, 4 hundruð. But thousand, thusand, is feminine, although in modern Icelandic, it's typically treated as neuter. So, should I leave that in? I don't know. I am standing on a precipitous slope. So thousand is a typical feminine, so thusand, thusand, thusandar, thusand. And then in the plural, thusendir, thusendir, thusenda, thusendum. So if you're counting multiple thousands, 2,000, you need the feminine, right? Tvær thusendir, þrjár thusendir, fjórar thusendir. Okay. It's interesting that you have that difference in 2 and 3 where you have the R or not an R. You don't see a Z there in Gothic. You see thrym and tvam, and we would expect there to be a Z in Gothic where there's an R in Old Norse there. But you do see in some really old runic inscriptions, I'm talking old Elder Futhark inscriptions, you do sometimes see a Z after the dative plural im in some very archaic Proto-Norse, and so that may actually be a survival from that Z that used to be part of a dative plural ending in earlier Old Norse, which we'd infer would be there anyway. But for instance, we see, Gestums, that's on the Steintoften inscription, DR 357, that's southern Sweden, somewhere in the early 600s. We do see that Z, and that may be the origin of the R in Thremer, Thremer, Tvemer. All right. So here's another interesting thing about how you count in Old Norse. If 1 is in the number, so if it's 1 or if it's 21, 11 doesn't count because it's its own word, but if it's 1, 21, 3 tens and 1, 101, 100, 3 tens and 1, whatever, as long as 1 is in there, the word 1, the referent is singular. This is not all that unusual among Indo-European languages, but it can throw off English speakers, right? I don't say 21 ship or 20 and 1 ship. I say 21 ships. But in Old Norse, you still use the singular. So while we talk about ein maður, 1 man, and tver men, 2 men, we talk about tuttugu och ein maður, 20 and 1 man singular, because ein is in there, and so it's going to govern a singular referent. Similarly, 200 och ein maður, 200s, really 240, and 1 men, but maður, man, is in the singular. So interesting stuff there. Now, another thing to mention is that the ordinals should be pretty familiar to a speaker of another Germanic language today or yesterday. So I'll give you 1st through 10th. Those are fyrsti, annar, which also means other, þriði, fjórði, fimmti, seti, sjaundi, niundi, tiundi. And then for instance, 20th, that's tutukundi. For 30th, threetukundi. 40th, fertukundi. And then the ones from 50 up are a little more predictable. Femtukundi, sextukundi, sjautukundi, åttatukundi, nitukundi, titukundi, ellevutukundi, right, 11th. And then, interestingly, words for hundredth and above in the ordinals are not attested in Old Norse. Now, as I mentioned, anar is a adjective that can mean both second and also other. So we frequently see it in that meaning. It is related to English other. It's from the same root. This word inflects a little bit differently than people typically expect. That has to do with what happens to an N followed by a thorn in the history of Old Norse. For those who are curious, I'll put the inflection up there for you, but just to point this out, to make it a little clearer, it basically has normal adjective endings. But if you think of the root as sort of two different things, if it is followed by another consonant, anar with two R's, anarar, anari, then the root form is anar. If it's followed by another vowel, then the root form is adr. That's why you get adrir, adrar, odrum with you umlaut. That may help make that look a little bit clear and more understandable. And then also, I guess you could call a number the word for both. That inflects in all, I was about to say numbers because I'm used to saying gender case and number, but of course the number is 2 for both. So in the masculine, boðir, boða, for nominative and accusative. Feminine, boðar, boðar. Neuter, baði, baði. And then genitive and dative for all those genders are boðum, dative plural, and begja, genitive plural. So as I mentioned, numbers in Old Norse are kind of interesting because it is a different way of categorizing numbers almost. It's a little bit like the different way that Old Norse categorizes color based on what we might expect in a modern Germanic language like English. But the vocabulary of numbers is still pretty familiar, right? I mean, most of these words do look recognizably similar to their English cognates. Ein, one, tver, two, threer, three, hundra, thousand, 100,000. Not too terribly different, and the same with the ordinals. Fyrsti, which I believe actually English first is borrowed from that. I think in Old English it's forma. So, I hope if you're studying Old Norse, this has been useful and or interesting for you. I hope that if you enjoy these presentations made for free in beautiful places, you'll consider looking at my Patreon. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, I am wishing you all the best.